After all the way we see, I got my hands full of machine. You can just put online, so I got some peace of mind. I can keep on crying at night. Got no more shade to keep on fight. Hanging out to hear the ring. All I got is a machine. After all the way we see, I got my hands full of machine. You can just put online, so I got some peace of mind. After all the way we see, I got my hands full of machine. You can just put online, so I got some peace of mind. I can keep on crying at night. Got no more shade to keep on fight. Hanging out to hear the ring. All I got is a machine. After all the way we see, I got my hands full of machine. You can just put online, so I got some peace of mind. I can keep on crying at night. Got no more shade to keep on fight. Hanging out to hear the ring. All I got is a machine.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the What If Cinema podcast. Today, we are very, very excited to have with us Leigh Singer. Leigh, hello, how are you?
Hi guys, nice to see you. Very well. I mean, relatively, given everything. But yes, so far so good. How about you?
Yeah, we're good. We're good. We know that because today we're recording this episode is October 22nd, and you guys just had a very busy and very eventful London Film Festival. So hopefully you're catching up on some much needed sleep after those last 10 days.
No, it was a very busy and eventful couple of weeks, but as ever, incredibly inspiring and fulfilling. But yeah, it's nice to have a sort of less intense week, and that's usually when like everything hits. You keep the sort of bugs and whatever at bay, and then usually you crash the week after. So I'm a little bit in that mode, but still, happy to be here.
Wonderful. Well, we're glad to have you here, and for anybody who's familiar with Leigh's work, Leigh is a video essayist. He's published several different video essays for a number of different websites and publications, including Sight and Sound magazine, Little White Lies, and has been a programmer for the London Film Festival. And we wanted to invite Leigh onto what is ostensibly our first podcast episode to talk a little bit about the art of video essay creation and kind of branching out maybe into a broader conversation about how that intersects with cinephilia. And I mean, I guess maybe the first place to start would be to talk about cinephilia, at least your cinephilia, Leigh. Where did the roots of your cinephilia first take hold?
I mean, it's so sort of fundamental to me, the way that I think, or, to the extent that I do think of myself, that it just seems like it was sort of embedded or, infected at an early age. It's funny, actually. Speaking of the London Film Festival, one of the events I hosted was a sort of panel for the sort of very renowned British film producer Jeremy Thomas, and he talks and a filmmaker called Mark Cousins has just made a documentary on Jeremy. And in that documentary, Jeremy Thomas talks about, I mean, his background, his father and his uncle were prolific filmmakers. So, you know, he had a sort of ringside seat in terms of industry stuff. But he talks about becoming infected at a very, very sort of formative age. And that was something that, you know, even in a sort of pandemic times, that doesn't feel like the wrong word, weirdly, because it's something that sort of takes over you. But I guess then, unlike, you know, if we're going to extend this ridiculous metaphor that I've somehow brought in, if you're going to extend it, it's something that you want, you know, you want to be infected with, and you sort of actively encourage to flourish and multiply. But it does feel like, I don't know where it came from. I mean, my family were certainly interested in, you know, the arts, but in terms of my own stuff, even from a very young age, I remember, you know, writing down the name, you know, in the early days of like videotaping movies off the TV and things like that, you know, very diligently writing down the names and the year of release and who was in it. Not so much director, because I was a bit too young to sort of understand that kind of stuff, but certainly who was in it. And it's just sort of continued that way. And I was just, it was, you know, it's interesting sometimes when you talk to just people out and about, the idea of going to see a movie by yourself is almost, it can be seen as a bit of a stigma, like you haven't got anyone to go with, or this is not, you know, it should be a sort of group activity. I was never happier than just, you know, going off by myself to see something that I'd sort of read about in a film magazine that wasn't necessarily, you know, a very big sort of popcorn movie, but I just heard of and sounded interesting. And I would spend, you know, many, many happy hours by myself in a cinema. I did have friends and I went with friends frequently, but that sort of solo activity, especially for things that I didn't necessarily assume other people, you know, my friends would be interested in or family would be interested in, that was a pleasure. That wasn't like, oh, I have to go by myself. So it started really early, and it just sort of, you know, it just kept going. And I never questioned it. It was just, this is what I love. This is what I love to do. This is what I like to read about. This is what I love to sort of see how it's, you know, out there in the world. And that extended all the way through to eventually when I went to university, I did a film. It was a film and literature degree. So it was a joint degree, but a big draw of it was the film side. You know, I had sort of possibilities to do more traditional English type degrees at kind of probably more prestigious universities, but it just, once I knew that course existed and I had an opportunity to be accepted on it, the other stuff just wasn't as interesting to me. So it kind of then extended in that direction too.
And then, I mean, just when you were talking a little bit a moment ago about you recognized the things that you loved and that you were drawn to, even at a young age, what were some of the qualities about either the film going experience or about films themselves that you responded to instinctually?
I mean, it's hard to sort of quantify. I just think that obviously, you know, like everybody else, you watch stuff on the TV and, you know, in those days video, but that whole kind of experience inside a cinema and, you know, the things that everyone talks about, you know, I don't think this is anything revelatory, but, you know, being in the dark, the huge screen, the sort of the beam of light, all of that kind of stuff. And then the communal experience. I mean, if you're talking about formative experiences, I remember I was pretty young, but I went to see Back to the Future in my local sort of cinema. And I don't know when it was, but it was a busy screening, you know, it was a very popular movie. And I'm sure you guys know the film and the ending of that film, right? Which is a pretty special ending. And the car sort of exploded at the screen, the credits went up, the music going, and British audiences, I mean, you guys have spent some time in the UK, so I don't know how you found British audiences compared to audiences back home where you guys are, but they tended to be fairly, you know, muted. And that film ended and the whole audience stood up and cheered. And I got an unbelievable sort of like, I literally was buzzing. I still remember walking out of that cinema almost like sort of, you know, like a sort of glow, because it was that recognition of what a film could do to a group of people. And like I say, audiences here are not necessarily representative of audiences worldwide. They are typically a little bit more, you know, conservative in how they react to stuff. But to see a British audience go absolutely crazy because they just, you know, you can look at that film, and actually I teach it at the moment sometimes, and look at the themes and the ideas and all this kind of stuff. But actually that is just a sensory experience of absolute joyful entertainment. And, you know, that movie lands. I mean, it's one of those sort of scripts that just hits every beat. And so at the end of it, that was the response. And I just thought, wow, how amazing to be involved in producing something like that. Do you know what I mean? And so it was a big thrill. And I think those kind of things, and, you know, there were other screenings that had a similar, I don't know, what would you call it, sort of impact. And certainly not even about the group stuff, but, you know, sometimes just going by myself. I mean, on a completely different end of the spectrum, I remember sort of bunking off school one afternoon. I mean, I was much older then. I was like probably, you know, late teen. But Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer was showing in the tiniest screen in that same cinema, actually, in Reading, where I grew up in the UK. And it was like, I don't know, 3 o'clock screening. So I snuck out, got out of school, went to see it. And I was about 3 people in the audience. And I don't know if you've seen that film, but it's incredibly intense. And there's a scene in the middle, which I won't spoil, but it's just horrific. And it absolutely floored me in a very, very different way to Back to the Future. But it's like, again, just the power of what a movie can do and how it can make you feel, and, you know, the questions it might leave you with, because that film is very much about, you know, the culpability of the audience if you're watching violence, and spectatorship, and, you know, complicity, all that sort of stuff. So, you know, 2 very, very different examples, but those kind of screenings where they really shake you up and they have an impact on you. I mean, I'm also a very, very music fan, and, you know, literature and things. So it's not like film is the exclusive medium that's had that effect on me. But I think it does have that sort of enveloping thing that other art forms have parts of. But for me personally, I think film is the one that does the most. It has that most sort of 360 enveloping thing. You know, music you can maybe look at as the sort of purest sort of, you know, distillation that goes straight to your sort of gut. But I think because often we're looking at a world that we recognize, but maybe we're not part of, and it's got sound and image and, you know, various other reasons, I think that's the thing that's always made the biggest impact on me. So, yeah, I mean, I think very traditional sort of things, but it just to recognizing those moments where you feel like, you know, a work of art, if you want to call it that, has, you know, genuinely had a sort of a profound effect on you as a person. And, you know, and there've been many, and, you know, the fortunate thing is that still happens. I mean, obviously less so as you get older and you're a bit more kind of used to how films work, but when it happens nowadays, it's sometimes even more special because it's sort of broken through your kind of critical observations and your sort of slightly jaded experience, and that's really amazing.
Absolutely. No, I think you've definitely hit on something very special here. I mean, for me and Sergio, I remember a couple of years ago when I was actually in the UK for the holidays, and I sat Sergio down to watch Planes, Trains, and Automobiles for the first time. He had never seen it, and you know, it was, you know, it's a perennial favorite in my household as well. But there's something really enriching about, as you say, not being very prescriptivist about how we designate things as art, and about basking in that sort of in the value of communal experience, no matter if it's Back to the Future or Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, which, by the way, does sound like a fantastic double feature.
I was going to say that's got to be a double bill now, right?
Yeah, Sergio, you're gonna program that, right, at some point?
Yeah, of course.
But Sergio, I was wondering if I mean, what your thoughts were on kind of what Leigh was talking about, like in terms of also not just like cultural experience and exposure to these experiences, but also I think the value of just the value of watching films, and what that kind of relationship to the, you know, this being a spectator in an audience does for you.
I think I mean, from what Lee's been saying, Lee coming from a film enthusiast background and also having studied film as film studies, I think that there's a kind of particularity with video essayists that focus their work on cinema, on the art of analyzing films. That I think that the background is almost always the same, you know, coming from being a cinephile, having all of these studies. So I would like to ask you, Lee, if you can remember that first instance when you realized that you wanted to do video essays, or that you wanted to explore this because you saw something, or I don't know if you can remember that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my experience might be a little bit different to other people's in that, you know, I had been a journalist and a film journalist and critic, writer, whatever you want to call it, for a good, how long? Maybe 10, 12, maybe 12, 13 years. So I had been, you know, watching movies with a view to sort of analyzing and, you know, critiquing and writing about them for a good while. But obviously it was in the written format. And, you know, without boring you with a long history, I got into a stage where I was getting a bit jaded and a bit, you know, not enjoying what I was doing anymore. And so, I mean, it wasn't like a sort of, you know, one moment, but I started to see some of, I guess, the very early prolific and influential video essayists stuff on YouTube. Because really, you know, I mean, the very fact that we're doing this on YouTube, it was the game changer. You know, that is the platform and the social media thing above all the others, and still is in terms of this, where people could put stuff up and anyone could watch it, comment on it, respond, etc. So I started to see, and these would be the very, you know, traditional names that you guys would know as well. So people like Koganada, people like Kevin Lee, the Every Frame of Painting channel, Matt Zoller Sites, and it just really, it kind of made an impression on me because before any of that stuff, I had always been interested in making things. So I'd shot a few little short films, and, you know, I'd written scripts and I had an agent. So, you know, I was already sort of going down or looking at a possible route for producing my own work. And suddenly when I saw this, I realized, or in my head, what made sense was it was a kind of combination of the two things I was doing, right? So it was the journalism side of it, but it was also the kind of creative side, because obviously writing is a very creative endeavor, and there has been, and it continues to be, absolute genius work in a written format about film. But this, because ultimately what they were doing was editing and actually putting together a piece of audiovisual material, because, you know, you're choosing music, you're choosing text on screen, you know, you're often, you know, integrating different pieces, you know, stills, maybe other art forms. I looked at it as filmmaking, and I still do, you know, maybe with a very small f, because usually you're using someone else's original material. But if you want to talk about what is the unique thing to filmmaking, it's editing, right? It's shooting and editing. So to my mind, what I was seeing was a combination of two things that I was interested in. And it immediately made me think, well, is that something I could then try? Because, you know, a lot of the written pieces that I'd done, it felt a little bit formulaic. And I just felt like, for myself, this would maybe break me out of a sort of slight straitjacket that I was in terms of my own work. And so I was fortunate in that I already did have some editing software, certainly not the best, you know, around, but something I could put clips into and mess around with on the timeline. And so I did, and I just made a sample. And I've, you know, I've told this story several times, but basically I did effectively a supercut on breaking the fourth wall. So, you know, moments that in movies where they acknowledge that they're movies, or, you know, the camera is acknowledged in some way. And I sent it to Matt Zoller Sites, who I didn't know, but who was at the time the editor of an IndieWire sort of video site called Press Play. And I just said, look, I'm a journalist from the UK. I've just made this. I don't know if you'd be interested in taking a look. See what you think. And, I'm sure you've sent tweets or messages or emails out to people that you don't know who are quite high profile. There's often very little, hope that there'll be a response or an interest. But to give Matt enormous credit, within a couple of hours, he'd gotten back to me and said, I really like it. I'd like to put it on the site. I'll write an introduction to it, and blah, blah, blah. And so within a couple of days, it was up on IndieWire. And I think because that subject is kind of light and fun, and I used lots of movies that people knew, it went a bit crazy. And it had a couple of 100,000 views in a week or two. I can't remember the specifics, but, it did ridiculous for me, ridiculous well. And I was blown away. And it wasn't just, it had the number of views. I think at the end of the piece, either in Matt's written piece or in the video, I can't remember exactly, we said something like, so which examples would you use? And I think ridiculously my email was on this piece. The page is gone now, thank God. But basically, I started to get dozens of emails, probably over 100 in the end, from people who've watched it, with suggestions and commenting on the video, and calling me out for not including this, but saying, oh, I really love that you put this, and did you not think of this? And anyway, the bottom line is it turned into a conversation. And to me, that has been the thing that I had always wanted from any sort of creative endeavor, certainly journalism. And if you think about the old days where you wrote for a magazine, a newspaper, whatever, if you were lucky, 2 months later or a week later, there'd be one reply from a reader, right, referencing the thing you wrote whatever months ago. And obviously social media can be very bad in this realm, because you can get pylons and really outrageous stuff. But if people are genuinely interested, that very, not instantaneous, but very quick back and forth became something that I really valued. And so I started basically conversations with a lot of these people. And to cut a very long story short, about a year later, I made a sequel to that video. I included a lot of people's suggestions. I then got in touch with them where I could and said, hey, that video you saw a year ago, here's another one. I put yours in, I credited them all at the end of it. And it just became this sort of ongoing dialogue. And I think that's one of the things that I had missed from, my own experiences as a writer. And just, it was something I saw as a new real possibility, this kind of communication and connection, because I think that's where, obviously, like I say, it can go wrong, right? But in general, if you're doing something genuine and enough people are interested, you can actually build something even more interesting. And that whole community idea that comes up with the, in the right circumstances with the internet is great. So that just basically kind of inspired me. And so I was very lucky. I don't think that would have happened without Matt Zoller Sites' sort of patronage. If I just put that up on my own Vimeo page, wouldn't have got a fraction of the interest. And I'm very aware of that. So I'm always incredibly grateful to him for that. But then, it really sparked my interest. And so I started to do it on a more regular basis. So I started to do stuff for Press Play. And then that just very slowly evolved into, a sort of an ongoing thing, and, spread to other outlets and other types of video, and built from there, really. But it really came from just seeing the possibilities of combining two things I was interested in, a platform to put it on, and the sort of connection that you could, in the best case scenarios, foster with people out there interested in your stuff. I mean, the thing that I learned, and it took me a long time to learn this, whoever your friends are, whatever your kind of family is, when you put out something very specific about this, ultimately the reach is this. But actually there are people, whatever your subject is, right? If it's really obscure, foreign language movies or whatever, there will be people out there who are interested. So it's just finding that way to reach other people. And social media has a lot of very bad qualities, but that to me is one of the, massive positive sides of it. And, it just sort of opened up a whole new way, I guess, for me to sort of continue doing the thing that I was passionate about. and sort of renewed my passion in it, realistically.
Yeah, I think what you're mentioning leads very, very important into what video essays are really about, and I feel that in comparison to other mediums like written newspapers or magazines, video essays have the particularity of analyzing films or analyzing images in general in ways that we were not able and we still are not able to do in other kind of mediums.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is more about the tools of what the video essayists are using, because I feel that's really important. And you mentioned this before. I feel that editing softwares like Premiere gives gives more possibilities of not just the final product, but to analyze the films. I don't know if you can talk a bit more about that. How do you use your editing software in other kind of ways for the purpose of having a final piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's really important, because, you know, technology sort of moves so fast, it's almost unimaginable for us, like today, to think back 50, 60 years. And film critics, I mean, I've read stories of like people like Robin Wood, who wanted to review a Hitchcock film. You know, they'd seen it once and then they had to chase it around London to find another screening just to check their notes that they'd noted the dialogue down right, or that camera shot was exactly what they remembered. And so that, I mean, that obviously shows their dedication and their passion, and the fact that they could make such fantastic writing about those films with such a difficult way of seeing the film. You know, no video, nothing, no way to watch it at home, none of that. So where we are today, where you or I, if we have the relevant software, can literally go frame by frame through a piece of visual art, is crazy. And you're at such a different level of ability to analyze and reflect on. So for me, and it's a personal thing, but you know, I assume it applies to other people sometimes as well. I get to sit, if I'm doing a video on a certain film or a certain filmmaker, I get this unbelievable privilege of sitting with their work in an unbelievably intimate and close analysis type of way that, you know, even wasn't really possible when you had an old video player and you could like pause it and play it and pause it and play it. You know, you can literally go frame by frame, you can, and then you can play with it and reverse the footage or split screen it or whatever it is. You can do so many things. And I think for me, at least, it's changed completely the way that I'm able to think and write about film, because I'm now looking at it in a different way. You know, before all this was possible, even when I started out as a journalist, you went to a press screening, maybe you went to see it again, although I bet you most journalists didn't. So you're going off one screening, maybe some production notes, maybe if you're writing it a little bit later than everyone else, you read a few other reviews to give yourself a bit of a sense of, you know, how other people are feeling about it. But that's a completely different process to what is possible now. The other thing with video essays is you obviously need the material at home. So it's very difficult to make a video essay on a brand new release, right? And so there's a sort of reflection period, right? Because by the time it comes to a Blu-ray or a, you know, something you can download and access, that film has been in the culture for maybe 2 or 3 months at most. Sorry, at least most. Anyway, you know, or you could have had years, right? I mean, you know, if you're doing something on Bergman or Fellini or whatever, you've got 60 years of stuff to draw on. But that also, that's one thing. But then you've still got this time that you can spend with the film or the films or whatever it is, and it's a kind of playtime, to quote your video essay, Sergio. It's basically an opportunity for you to have a relationship and develop a relationship with that piece of work that just simply was not possible before. And even nowadays, writers, reviewers, critics who watch it a couple of times, or even if they watch it regularly, like because it's a favorite movie, that sort of editing space is a very special sort of arena, I feel, because you're doing something that, you know, literally only the filmmaker and his or her editor and, you know, key production heads had access to before. That's unbelievable privilege. And so I hope, and I think this is reflected in, you know, what I think of as the best videos around. They're then able to look at it differently. They're then able to find new ways to talk about it, because the fundamental relationship between, for want of a better word, critic and artist is entirely different. And it's why I'm such an advocate of video work. You know, a lot of my friends and colleagues, they've maybe dabbled in it, or they've done a voice for a video, or maybe even played around with one or two. But until they've been in that sort of arena, I think it would open a lot of people's eyes to greater possibilities. And I think that's what we should be doing. In as much as you should be pushing the art form, you should also be pushing the ways that you can talk about and analyze and engage with the art form. And to me, that is the absolute plus of whatever you want to call them, video essays, audiovisual criticism, because it puts you in a space that you basically were never able to enter before. And that's a real luxury. And, you know, if it's then used in the right way, it can produce some really, really interesting new ideas, I think.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a really wonderful point to make, Leigh, and especially now that in the age of, well, streaming and media, the dissemination of media on a level that has never been seen before. I mean, there is this sort of narrative that's being perpetuated that we have more access to more films than ever before. So like you were saying with Robin Wood trying to track down Hitchcock, or I'm thinking of, for example, Frederick Jameson being one of the only writers in the States to have written an article about Edward Yang's The Terrorizers, which for years was really hard to see. But now we can actually watch the majority of Edward Yang's filmography on Mubi or some other streaming service in relatively good quality. And so then branching off from some of those considerations, I was wondering, what are some of the challenges that you've undertaken in terms of maybe stepping outside of your comfort level or familiarity with what you've known? I mean, particularly in the realm of world cinema, because it is so vast. And once we think we've kind of got a grasp on the canon of Fellini and Bergman, there's always a slew of other filmmakers like Miklos Jankso or Michael Haneke or any other filmmaker who all of a sudden, because their work was unavailable for so many years, it's now more available. And now that's challenging our conception of what the canon is and how we respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. The way I've often approached projects is I've used them as an excuse to get to learn about the film. So very often I've taken on a project. I mean, Bergman and Fellini are very good examples because I've done big pieces on both of those guys. I had probably seen a handful of the most famous films, right? So, you know, whether it's Seventh Seal and Persona, or whether it's Dolce Vita and 8.5. But I simply hadn't gotten around to, or been too lazy or whatever you want to call it, to see, you know, to go into the sort of deeper cuts. So then when I made pieces on both those guys, it was my sort of duty and it was my opportunity to then go and find some of their rarer stuff. I mean, this is a horrible name drop, so I sort of apologize, but it's just because it will illustrate the point. So the BFI are just doing a sort of 4-series box set on Bergman, like start to finish. And so they just did the first one, which are his earliest films. Mm-hmm. So from the late 40s through to, I think the last one is 1950. And even a couple of it he didn't direct. He just wrote the scripts for. Long story short, I got asked to do a video essay for it. And I think I'd seen one of those movies, or maybe none. I can't remember actually, maybe one. But basically, I then got hold of all those films. And because I'd actually previously done a Bergman video, I was a bit more versed in his other, you know, his later work. And one of the fantastic things for me was to be able to watch those movies and then make some connections either thematically or literally sometimes shots that he, tried out early on and sort of refined, when he was a sort of more experienced director. And so the video essay that appears on in that box set, I'm not making massive claims for it, but it was just trying to be a brief primer into the stuff you see at the beginning. You'll recognize, if you watch these movies, even though he's obviously a very callow and, new filmmaker, you can see where this is going, or you can see how he developed some of those ideas, or you can see how his love of actresses, or you can see how his love of sort of, kind of fourth wall breaking and postmodern stuff is, started off. And that was just, in a weird way, sort of learning on the job. I mean, the job in terms of the editing I was experienced in, but in terms of watching and knowing those films, they were new to me. But I felt, well, I'll be able to, I had enough confidence that I'll be able to do it, even if I haven't seen those movies, because I know the later stuff. But it was like my opportunity to see those films. And so that was, every project I try and do, either there's two sort of things. I want there to be something of a discovery every time. So that will either be a film or a part of a film or something that I haven't seen before. Or if I know the films well, in the actual edit, I'll try and do something, sometimes just very tiny, but something I haven't done before to sort of try and improve my video editing skills, so animating some font or, doing some effect I haven't tried before, or something with the text that I'd always wanted to do but hadn't done. So for me, that's got nothing to do with the final product. That's just purely for my own sort of, need, that each thing I do feels like there's even if it's the tiniest thing that no one else would recognize, there's some sort of progression or development of what I'm doing. And like I say, obviously, if that's from the films themselves, then that's almost like a really great luxury, because I'm basically getting a chance to watch stuff and do a project on them at the same time. And then if it's a technical thing, that's just like, well, that's for my own benefit to sort of, so I could just get better, because, there are people who are way, way better at editing software, at use than I am. But as long as I'm improving, or I'm trying to improve, that to me is the sort of goal. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I think that, so in terms of rarer films, I don't know that I've done stuff on really rare films, because that just, part of the big thing of video essays is access to the footage. Mm-hmm. It's very hard, and people have actually done this, right, where they've taken it's almost like, well, here's what I imagine this film would be. It hasn't come out yet, but based on the guy's other films, sort of put together a trailer of what we think it might be, or whatever. But that hasn't tended to be what I've done. I mean, I suppose the closest example I had was years ago. I did a video on sort of Holocaust cinema and, what is sort of acceptable to show. And I used some films that I'd sort of only heard of, but had seen and actually incomplete. So there's a Polish film from the early 60s by a guy called Andrzej Munk, called I'm going to mangle the pronunciation. It's Pasażerka, but the English translation is Passenger. And he died before he completed that film. So the film was effectively completed by his friends trying to sort of preempt or presume what he was going to do. But it's one of those very unusual films, because they even say, like, the narration comes on and it's very self-aware, basically saying we don't actually know if this was going to be how it is. But it was a fascinating movie to do for that, because it was, that video was all about images that maybe shouldn't be used, or should be used, and in this case, then it was a filmmaker who actually hadn't completed his film. So my experience with sort of like really rare films is fairly small, because I think there's enough films that are available, but they just haven't been seen by enough people to kind of keep you busy. And so then the access for your own work isn't the problem, and it's just more of a sort of putting it out there and maybe making people a bit more aware of stuff that they might not have seen before, get them interested in it.
Yeah, and I think that extends out to a curatorial practice as well, in terms of effectively trying to counter the limitations of when these films are hard to find. As programmers, how we try to find those films and screen them for people, and to broaden a notion of what world cinema is. And I know that you've spoken a lot about, particularly through the genre of comedy, about world cinema, and you'll be talking about a, a, a rather large range of films. I know, for example, once we had a discussion about Jafar Panahi's Offside. And so as a curator, how do you sort of position those selections of kind of either genre or world cinema? How do you, well, what I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about your process as a programmer, and about what some of the key qualities that you're looking for in the films that you choose to program within either the London Film Festival or any other context.
I mean, London's is maybe a useful one to discuss in that sense, because basically, for people who don't know, several years ago, when the new sort of head of the festival, she's left now, but when she came in, she effectively sort of changed the structure of it. So the strands within the festivals were effectively genre strands. So they were called things like love, thrill, dare, cult, laugh. And since that happened, my sort of advisory role was always laugh. So I was effectively sort of overseeing the kind of comedy selection. Now, it's never a one-person job, and there's always other people involved, but that was sort of my, specific remit. So within that, for me, it was always, I mean, just very obvious things, I guess, but it was always very important to, first of all, make sure you had a nice range of, national cinemas, present. It was very important to get female directors, or not basically broaden it from your traditional white male directors, and then the type of comedy, because it's something that I'm fascinated by, but how much variety you can get within that, from very broad slapstick to sort of very witty wordplay to kind of very black humor to kind of very surreal. So every year the challenge was to try and get as wide a representation of what we considered comedies in, and at times actually really pushing the sort of the definition a bit. And I think not overdoing it, because there is a certain contract then between the viewer and the programming team, that if you put something in, something called thrill, you would hope that people find it, at some point vaguely exciting or, kind of thrilling. And similarly with laugh, I think even more so with laugh, because that's a bit of a deal breaker. It's like either you find something funny or you don't. But that said, it was always important to put something that we felt might really challenge people's perception of what is comedy. And, my own personal taste is quite, in terms of humor, it can be, it's not only exclusively, but I'm a big fan of very dark black comedy. So, we would put things in there that, I can imagine other people saying that's not a comedy or that's not funny. But the idea was not to sort of then make them reject it, but, in best case scenario, maybe question, well, is it doing something that's got a kind of, an element of humor going on, or even an element of non-seriousness, or whatever you like define it. But it's a tricky one. But I think because it was a real challenge, and is and still is. I mean, even this year, some of the films we had in the festival, in the Strand, I think, there's the very obvious example is the Romanian film that won at Berlin, Rada Jude's Bad Luck Banging, or Loony Porn. I mean, it starts with a 3 or 4 minute hardcore pornography scene. Mm-hmm. Now, immediately, this guy's a smart filmmaker, so he's not unaware the impact that might have on an audience. But it's also really pushing, it's pushing buttons, but it's also pushing the sort of boundaries of like, is this funny? And then, it's about a sex tape that gets leaked, and, the resulting sort of discussion and kind of, uproar that it causes for the person in it and the community around it. But, that is not, just because it won Berlin or, it's got some sort of prestige. It's still, if you watch the film, because I hadn't seen it until, several months later. And I was pretty sure, I feel like I've seen enough things where I shouldn't be that shocked. but it's like, wow, okay, this is a fairly this is a very explicit and very challenging, provocation. And is that funny? And are people going to be upset by that? And then the interesting stuff is, how do you frame that within a curational role? How do you write about that in the program notes? A few years ago, we had a film from Belarus, which was really good. What the hell was it called? I remember the director. Her name was Daria. Crystal Swan. And it was basically a kind of fish out of water film set in the 80s. Really good. But there was, towards the end, a really challenging rape scene. It wasn't that it was so explicit what you saw on screen, but the tone of it completely changed that film. Just because of the distress you were hearing and all that kind of stuff. And that was a really, so when I wrote that up for the notes, it was like really trying to flag it up without going over the top and saying, oh my God, watch out for this scene, because then almost that makes it a bigger thing than it was. But the director, Daria, she came and did Q&As, and they were really interesting because we had people in the audience who were like, I was really enjoying that film. And then that scene came on and it made me really, puzzled. Why did you do it? And why did you show it? And how? But it opened a discussion. And again, going back to my thing about the connection and communication, that's where I want to be. I want to be involved in that side of things. And she was very smart and very open to people's feedback. And she gave her answer of why it was justified. Now, she wasn't going to convince everybody. And I'm sure some people went out there feeling a bit, cheated or a bit, disappointed or angry. But she, and I guess by extension, we as the festival, felt there was some thought behind it. It wasn't just a kind of, casual and, sloppy use of something that inflammatory. And so then it becomes an interesting thing. And, to frame that within a comedy strand, there are challenges with that. But I think those are quite exciting and quite, they're not easy calls. And I think, it shouldn't be easy if you're going to do this job properly.
Of course not. And I mean, I just briefly wanted to say it's really interesting that you bring up the Radu Jude film, which I saw a few weeks ago for the first time. And the thing that also struck me about the film is that the way it plays with genre, that, as you say, it even ostensibly says at the beginning that it's a comedy. And yet there's a whole section in the middle of the film that actually is much closer to a video essay, where Jude is offering something of a semiotic dictionary of terms, in relation to pornography, obscenity, history, genocide, and as an audience member, I can imagine going into something that is marketed as a comedy. It opens with a sex tape, and in the middle, we're getting this very intellectually dense exploration of language and history and barbarism. And so, but I think it's really great that any filmmaker is playing with the semiotics, I suppose, of the film essay within what is a genre exercise. And so as a video essayist yourself, how do you kind of play with genre? Because you've done that before, specifically with something like your video essay on Goodfellas as a sitcom.
Oh, yeah. I didn't think of that. I mean, if I'm brutally honest, that's not necessarily at the forefront of, what I'm often doing. I think the Goodfellas one is a. I mean, thank you for bringing it up, because I wouldn't have thought of it if you were asking it. I suppose that's an example of that where I don't even know how that came about. Oh yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if you recall, and maybe this is too inside baseball for people who are watching this, but on the course that we did at National Film School, did I show you that Goodfellas clip at the beginning of the thing? Right. So I'm intrigued by that clip, because I'm like more than intrigued. I'm fascinated by that clip, because for people who don't know, it's the Joe Pesci, funny how scene. And the way that switches between kind of horror to comedy to sort of watching other people perform finding something funny because the consequences of that may be more damaging. I just thought there was something in there that was, there was something to play with. And so to kind of take it to its, almost ridiculous extreme and make it a sitcom was then intriguing to me. and putting the canned laughter on, and I mean it's almost a bit too complicated to try and go through, but there was a lot of choice in even the type of laughter I had, like tracks and tracks of different canned laughter on my timeline, and trying to choose the right one. And again, it's not that necessarily anybody will pick up on it, but for me, I wanted to try and get in there, and that is one of the most divisive pieces I've ever done. Some people thought it's absolute rubbish, like it, and I think some people were almost assuming, because I think the way it was marketed was almost like it wasn't just that scene, like I was going to do almost like the whole film and do excerpts, and it's literally that one scene. So maybe that was something else that made it a little bit, expectations are then set in a different way. I mean, I really like it. And I there's friends of mine who are video essayists who hated it, who are like, it's not even a video essay. And I was like, well, I disagree. And I can tell you why, but, I don't necessarily need to convince you. But for me, it absolutely is using a film in an analytical way to kind of provoke ideas, and that to me is part of what a video essay is about. And I think you could also just look at it as a bit of fun, because I don't know how much even thought necessarily people gave to it, because it's like, oh, it's okay, it's a funny how, and you've made it into a comedy, complete with the sort of Seinfeld sting music and the Friends titles and all that stuff. And I think I did a parody of, I think, Brooklyn Nine-Nine for the titles. So it wasn't specific. It was not supposed to be one specific sitcom. It was just almost like the genre of, those type of entertainments. But then obviously connecting it to, and I think the other thing is, if you know that film, then that character is a complete psychopath. So there's nothing funny about him. Although actually in the scene, I think he does make one decent joke. So all of these kind of ideas were floating around in there. And for me, that was a kind of playful way to have a little look at them. But I was very clear that it would not appeal to everybody. And I think, I mean, I haven't checked the stats or whatever, but the sort of percentage of down votes to up votes and things like that on YouTube was probably a lot more, a lot more of negative stuff than for the obvious ones. But maybe that's because it was not playing it safe. If you do a sort of very respectful thing on why Christopher Nolan's great, you can't go too far wrong, because his fans will watch it and go, yeah, no, you're right, well done. And that has its place, and I've done them, so I'm not mocking people who do them. I've done them myself, but those are fairly traditional, and I'm not saying they're easy, because if you analyze it well and you do good, you do good sort of research, it can still be a really, hopefully insightful piece. But you sort of know what the audience response might be to something like that. Whereas with the Goodfellas one, I was genuinely intrigued how it would go down, and it did spread. It was one of those, I mean, it's compared to other video essays, my stats are never like this kind of hundreds of thousands. I mean, occasionally, but very rarely hundreds of thousands or a million views or whatever on YouTube. But it got a little bit of traction, and it got talked about outside of the sort of traditional places that video essays get discussed because of what it did. So to me, that's a plus, right? Even if people don't like it, it's reaching audiences who maybe never seen a sort of video like that before. So, but you can't, and you shouldn't want to actually to please everybody. It was a bit of a gamble, and I'm personally, very proud of it. But it certainly didn't get like tons of amazing recognition. And as I said, I know actively friends of mine who really don't like it. So it's okay.
Yeah, I've been watching your video essays, Leigh, for the last months, maybe most of them, but I feel, I mean, in my personal opinion, I think that the Goodfellas one, it's still perhaps my favorite, because I think it really summarizes your work as a video essayist. It has experimentation, it has simplicity, it has comedy, which you are also very interested in. And I feel that I'm not saying that video essays should go that way, but I really think that that's like the essence of video essays, of keep experimenting with the form of what we have, adding things and all of that. So I'm really really happy to always see that video essay.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think what you're also sort of implying there is there's a lot of stuff which is much more traditional and following a sort of format. And that is true because what I'm also having to do, I mean, it's a choice, but ultimately it's part of my work and it's stuff that I get paid for.
Yeah.
So there are certain expectations when you do something for an outlet. I mean, I'm always interested in the academia side of things, where people can be very experimental, but it's almost like you're talking to a very small select bunch of people, and there's nothing at stake in terms of, does it get watched? Do I need to make a living out of this? And I think for me, the challenge has been, this is a job as well. And especially if you do like a series for an outlet, then you want people to sort of get hooked by whatever the sort of the premise of that is, and then within that, hopefully you deliver slightly different things along the way. But it's working in a different way to something like the Goodfellas thing. And I think to be able to carve out the space to do a bit of both and a bit more of, Sergio, what you're talking about is definitely where I'm heading now, because I'm much more interested in doing a bit more personal stuff and a bit more experimental stuff. But I also have to be realistic enough to balance that with work for effectively other people. I mean, it's generally, I'm not going to pretend like, I don't come up with the ideas, because, 9 times out of 10, it's something I pitch. So it's my choice. But it's also being aware who the audience is, what you can do within that. And I think for me, any art, if you want to call this sort of stuff art, when there are limitations, that's actually a really interesting area to work in. Whether they're financial, whether they're, censorship ideas, whatever it is, to have sort of things that you have to bump up against and find ways to navigate, to me is very interesting. And I think one of my, again, I'm a huge admirer of a lot of the academics who do this stuff, but some of my sort of, less, the things where I struggle with it a bit more is when it's like, well, who are you talking to and what are you actually doing with this? It's like, it just feels like, well, in the way that academic writing for me often goes round in circles. It's basically a bunch of people sitting in a circle talking to each other. And that to me is not that interesting, because again, going back to this thing about connection and, broadening an audience for something, or, getting people interested. And I think, because I was in that world for a short time, that side of things has never been that interesting to me. It's like I'm much more interested where you can sort of, develop conversations and widen perspectives. And of course, the best academia has done that, right? And the things that everyone now talks about, like, Laura Mulvey and the gays, right? Or Carol Clover and Final Girls and stuff. The things that are really, really brilliant, they break out of that sort of rarefied world and they become sort of common currency, if you like. But a lot of stuff doesn't. And a lot of stuff stays within that sort of rarefied world. And then my question is, well, what are you doing with that? Where is that going ultimately? But there are some great academic video essays, and their stuff does expand out of that. But I want that to be almost like the default position for people. I don't think that should be almost the exception to the rule. And I'm sure a lot of people would disagree, and that's absolutely fine. But, I think I've always looked at it as there's almost like two very polar opposites. There's the sort of YouTube, almost like super popular, super cut fan base stuff. And there's the academia world. And where I want to be positioned is in between those. So that you're doing something hopefully a bit more intellectually challenging and stimulating, but you're also trying to appeal to people outside of a very sort of small, cinephiliac community. And I'm not saying I always get it right at all. And, there are things that ultimately you look back and go, yeah, no, that didn't work. But to me, it's about trying to sort of broaden appeal and yet still try and play with, you know, interesting ideas. But, you know, it's not easy. I mean, if it was easy, then, you know, every video would be like, you know, a smash. But it's, you know, if you don't, you have to enjoy the process. And so far, I do. But, you know, it's good to try and find different ways to express yourself.
Absolutely. And I think that it stands to reason that every video that any content creator puts out there is ultimately, whether it's successful or it's a flop, it's always a learning process. And it's, I mean, for me, when I edit certain either video essays or Instagram reels for our channel here, it always, the process of editing these videos, sometimes I look back on them and I go, well, okay, that wasn't maybe conveying as succinctly what I was hoping it would convey, but it always teaches me a little bit about, okay, so this is teaching me a little bit more about my relationship as a spectator to the film or filmmaker and what it is about that work that has really captured my attention. And I mean, and I hope that, would you say that that's kind of the same thing for you, Leigh, in your process of whenever you make a video, whenever you finish a video essay or a video project, how do you feel like you've gauged your relationship to a film or a filmmaker before and after the video has been finished?
I mean, you know, of course you want to get to the end of the project, look at the final piece and feel satisfied or feel like you've done the best that you could do. But for me, it's also very much, and this is, you know, a slightly selfish thing, it's like, how was that whole process as well? You know, how was it to kind of do the research, watch the films, put it together? Because, you know, the end result is not always going to live up to your expectations or your hopes. But if the process and the project has been sort of felt kind of valuable to you, and, you know, you felt like that was time well spent and you learned something from it, or, you know, it made you think about things in a different way, then, you know, I think that's also very important. I mean, I suppose it's like, you know, I guess filmmakers, actors often talk about this, right? You know, maybe the film they were in, you know, the finished version isn't great or didn't get the reaction they wanted, but they maybe had an amazing time working on it and they had a very valuable experience with the crew or the cast or whatever it was. So I think there's definitely an aspect of that. And, you know, the viewing side, you know, people who watch it and stuff, I long stopped trying to predict what people would like, because occasionally you think, well, if I do a video on this director, that's going to get a massive amount of hits. And sometimes I've been like hideously wrong about that. And then you'll do something that seems far less obviously sort of commercial or popular, and it suddenly takes off. So, you know, the lesson really is just about do something that you feel you personally can add something to the discussion. You know, especially, you know, most of the stuff I do, you will find other either videos about it, or you'll find certainly writing about it or whatever. So it's not like, you know, you're, you know, hitting sort of virgin territory here. But can you do something that is adding something to that discussion or to that sort of collection of knowledge or analysis or whatever? And I think the more personal you can do this, and this is definitely where I'm hoping and planning on heading to go, because I think the personal side of it, I've noticed this with other video essays as well. Weirdly, that seems to chime more and more, I think, with people. You know, when you set it up as a sort of almost objective, almost like a lecture, you know, so Bergman uses these white shots and you can see here, here, and here how this goes. I mean, you know, if it's done well and, you know, has a certain amount of, you know, skill involved, they can still be good. But I'm personally losing a bit of interest in those in terms of making them. I think, you know, coming at it from a much more personal angle is where I would like to sort of move to, and maybe balancing that with, you know, outlets that want certain things, because, you know, again, just to reiterate, if you're doing it as a professional thing, there are certain elements that, you know, you need to sort of honor as well. But in terms of my own projects and things that I want to develop, I think that sort of more personal thing is definitely where I want to sort of just see if it works, because the downside of that is then it's very much, you know, you, and actually sometimes that's not what I want to hear about or even want to talk about. So it's a, you know, I think the possibilities are endless for this kind of stuff. right? You know, you can do so much. And it's like, I mean, I don't think we ever did this in a class, but, you know, one thing I often wanted to do, and it just hasn't been the time for it, is say to everybody, right, I want everyone to make a 3-minute video on Star Wars, right? Or a 3-minute video on Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And the amount of different approaches and angles and ideas and stuff that will come out will be amazing. And that's just one film or one filmmaker or something. So I just feel there's so many possibilities with this stuff. That, you know, you need to explore them all and not sort of get stuck in a kind of template thing. Although that is obviously a kind of, you know, it's a possibility when you're doing stuff, you know, for other people. You know, there's a certain expectation sometimes of what they want from you. And it's also your job to kind of maybe push back against that and say, well, yeah, I could do that, but how about if I do this? And, you know, we'll still do that sort of stuff, but we do it from this angle. And these are all conversations. I mean, it's a very long answer, so I'll keep it brief. One of the things that I've tried to really push in the last couple of years are sort of video essay interviews. So I will do an interview with a filmmaker or someone, you know, in the industry. And obviously, I don't know exactly what they're going to answer, but then I will make, it's not just going to be a talking head with illustrated clips. It's like I'm trying to then also use the video essay form of that creatively. So almost like a conversation with that person. And I've been very personally pleased with how those have gone, because I've had some people who are just fantastic talkers and come up with great stuff to do. But then it's almost like you set it up because you're asking certain questions. You don't know what they're going to answer, but then you respond with how you're going to visually put that into the piece. And that is something I hadn't seen anywhere. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm sure people go, oh no, but this person does and this person does it. But I hadn't seen those. I'd seen the very generic, you know, EPK type things, or I'd seen the video essayist sort of saying why the filmmaker is good. But I'm actually quite interested to hear how the people involved with it found it and what they wanted to say, if they want to talk about that, or what they feel about a certain thing, but then respond to that by how I would then try and visualize that on the screen. And so that to me has been something I've done more recently, where it's been a new way of doing stuff. So I did a piece with Mike Figgis, the director Mike Figgis, maybe earlier this year, on split screen stuff, because, you know, very famously he did the Time Code movie with the 4 cameras filming simultaneously, one shot, you know, overlapping and stuff. But then we could talk about Abel Gantz's Napoleon, and we could talk about sort of, you know, the whole kind of, you know, horror movies that happen on a screen. And we could talk about, you know, sort of 60s split screen and all of this sort of stuff. And so, you know, it was really interesting to hear someone who's done it talk about where their ideas for it came from, but and you know, what he thinks about all those things. But then how it's put on screen is my choice. Do you know what I mean? So it becomes this sort of weird collaboration with that person, and that felt to me something I hadn't seen. And again, whether they work or not is you know, entirely subjective, but they were very interesting kind of back and forths, because I could try and push him on certain things. Like it was fascinating because, you know, obviously in terms of split screen, someone like Brian De Palma is a bit of a, you know, master at that. He only wanted to talk about the time he met Brian De Palma, and Brian De Palma sort of said, oh, you stole a couple of my things there. And that was it. He didn't want to analyze it at all. So I had a whole idea of how I wanted to do all this stuff and put them side by side, but I can't force him to talk about that. He then did talk loads about, for example, Warhol and Woodstock. So that became a much bigger section, and, you know, just playing around with putting him in split screens. I ended up putting him inside split screen movies just because you can do that in the edit. I put him inside some of those horror movies, you know, where it's all the sort of zoom screens and stuff, and, you know, replaced him inside that. So, you know, it's having a bit of fun with it too. But it's an interesting, to me, I look at those as almost collaborations between me or the person who's making the video and the subject, because I am bored senseless sometimes of hearing my voice saying, you know, this means this and this is what I think. It's like, well, why don't I talk to the person who made it? I think they'd have maybe more interesting things to say about it than I would. And, you know, so I mean, I've been very fortunate. I had people like Celine Sciamma and Dario Argento and Edgar Wright, and before he died, D.A. Pennebaker. And those are amazing people to talk to because they have such great insights into not just their own work, but the work that inspired them for their things. But then it comes back to me, and it's like, well, how am I going to put that together as a video piece? So those kind of things are something that I definitely want to, you know, keep going. And, you know, it's a bit of a battle to try and persuade people. Actually, this is an interesting way to do stuff, rather than just a straightforward interview. But, you know, it's just one area of like, okay, that we can explore more. You know, that's something that hasn't been done that frequently. Let's see where that can go. So, you know, I basically very much agree with this whole idea. You've got to keep pushing the sort of the possibilities for how the form will go in the future.
Well, and I will say from my end, just having this conversation has already gotten me thinking about potentially formulating ideas about video essays, and maybe using this conversation as audio. But no, it's been really great.
Why not?
Why not? Why not?
Yeah.
I mean, it could happen. Sergio, do you have any last questions or final thoughts that you wanted to share with Leigh?
No, not really. I mean, I'm just really happy to hear you again, Leigh. It's been really, really inspiring, I think. As a first podcast, I think it's like the perfect way to start.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
And it's
very kind of you to say that. I feel I've made it really hard for you to cut because there's such long answers. I was like, as I was blabbing on, I was like, oh Jesus, how are they gonna get in and out of this? But you know, that's your problem.
Yeah, exactly. you're just here for the promotion. It's all good. You're just the guest. No,
no, but I hope I haven't made it too. I genuinely hope I haven't made it too difficult for you, and I apologize if so. I mean, it is because I'm passionate about this stuff, and it's, you know, so it's not about talking about myself. It's more about talking about the format and how it works and what I want it to become. And then, of course, you know, you maybe get a bit carried away. So I apologize for that.
No, not at all. I mean, you know, I feel like we've only just touched the tip of the iceberg here. I mean, for my own end, I know I would love to just talk about hours and hours about cinema, about video essays, and about genre, and specifically comedy. But I think that this has been a very inspiring conversation. It's definitely gotten me thinking a lot about, you know, a couple of projects on my own end in terms of video essays that have a more personal approach as well. And I've got a couple of ideas that I've been sort of formulating around, and one of which we'll be putting up actually on the site in November for, I mean, I won't say too much about it, but it's related to a particular movie that just had a 20th anniversary release. So I'm very excited for when that.
Great.
That goes
well,
live.
I mean, I don't know if this overlaps with your stuff because I know it's something else, but that essay you just wrote on Tsai Ming Lang, Nick, as I read that, I was like imagining it as a video piece immediately, because it's about bodies and it's about, you know, how they relate to the space around them and all that stuff. And I was like, you know, most good pieces can be, you know, you can imagine as videos, but that immediately struck me as like, you should do that as a video piece. I mean, the written piece is great, but you know, I can imagine it immediately. And I think because of what you're talking about, I think this is the other, sorry, just to final point. If you're talking about film, to be able to show the people that film is an unbelievable benefit. Because if you're writing an article about a movie and people haven't seen it, it's incredibly difficult to describe it well enough to give them a good sense of it. But if you can show that clip, if they've never even heard it, I mean, I'm doing some teaching for somewhere else at the moment, and we were looking at City of God, right? As we're doing genres, so we're doing it as a thriller. And these are very young students, but I started saying, so I think probably the two big influences that you could see from Hollywood are probably like Goodfellas and Pulp Fiction. And they all looked at me completely blank, and they hadn't seen, let alone heard. One person had heard of and seen a couple of clips from Pulp Fiction, I think. They hadn't heard of those movies. It was then incredibly hard for me to kind of carry on with that idea because I couldn't show them the stuff. Now, if you just frame that, if I did a video, in fact, I did do a video actually about City of God and brought those two in. But then even if they haven't heard of them, I can show them those sort of novel like chapters in Pulp Fiction and how that connects to City of God. I can show them the Goodfellas narration and how that connects to the narrator of City of God. And if I'm writing about it or talking about it, I can't do as good a job as Scorsese or Tarantino, obviously, you know? And so I think this is where the strength, another strength of the whole format really lies, because I've read enough great pieces where I haven't necessarily seen all the films or any of the films in the article in question. And if it was a video thing, even if it's a 20 or 30-second clip of that movie, that is going to so much more connect me to the argument that's being made and the sort of discussion, if you like, than a written piece. And so again, you know, I think it's, you know, it's not the same as that, you know, very famous dancing about architecture quote, because writing can be amazing about film, but, you know, to be able to show and use the clips that you're talking about is just such an amazing advantage then for the reader or viewer in this case, because they can immediately, and you know, everyone is so visually literate nowadays, you can see, like, if a shot does a pan and then you see someone else does that, or what goes from a wide and zooms in and you show how that, you know, split screen, whatever, you immediately get it, you know. And it's not quite the same depending on, you know, who's the quality of the writing, but it just doesn't hit in the same way, I don't think.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and you've hit a great point on, you know, one of the challenges from my end of writing about Simon Liang, about his work, you know, when you write about slow cinema, you can write, oh, this shot lasts for 5 minutes, you know, and that gives somebody a sense of what it is. But actually seeing, for example, the climactic shot of Goodbye Dragon Inn, of the theater, of the ticket seller sweeping the auditorium, it's like sitting with that and allowing yourself to kind of occupy that, your relationship with the image that's unfolding. I mean, it's a completely different experience, and that's the benefit, as you say, of the medium of visual media and of cinema. And
yeah, I mean, and slow cinema actually has particular issues for things like video essays. I mean, I think Kevin Lee did like, how do you make a Kiarostami video essay or something like that? Check it out. I mean, you'll find it on YouTube, I think. And I don't know if I showed it to you guys, but there's one about James Benning and how to do a sort of thing if you haven't seen the films that he did with Chloe Gallagher-Lanay. And they bump up against the sort of issues of how do you present that? Because like you say, that shot, the whole point of that shot is how long it lasts. And unless you're going to show that entire shot in the video essay, but then what are you going to do on top of it? And is that going to, you know, is that going to work in the way you want it to? Because if you're just showing the shot, well, then what are you doing differently to him, you know? But if you talk all over it, are you changing the nature of it? So there are definitely certain things where it becomes actually really complicated, and maybe not the ideal you know, I'm not saying therefore that video essay is the ideal expression for every type of discussion or analysis, because it's not exactly like you've just very smartly identified. That is a potential. How do we get through it? And if you sort of kept the shot but just kept fading through in sort of increments, you know, like skip 30 seconds and skip 30 seconds, you're sort of giving a sense of it, but you're maybe contradicting the whole way that it was presented in the first place. So, you know, but I think in a lot of cases, it can provide such a great way to sort of illustrate and analyze that other forms, i.e. writing and maybe other forms, or, you know, broadcasting, just can't do in the same way.
Absolutely. It's been a real joy and a privilege talking with you, Leigh, and I hope that we can do it again some other time, because like I said, I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
Well, thank you. I mean, you know, I apologize for going on for so long, but you know, if there's something in there you can use, please, by all means, cut it down and use it. Thank you for having me as well. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Leigh. It's been a pleasure.
All right. I'm going to end the broadcast, and